Okay, so good morning, everyone. This is the second session of the 2023 Fall Emerald Ash Borer University series. My name is Bob Bruner, and I am the Exotic Forest Pest Educator with Purdue University's Department of Entomology. Today, we will be hosting one of our Purdue foresters, Lenny Farlee, who's going to be talking to us today about planting trees for resilient woodlands. Lenny, do you want to take it from here?
Thanks very much, Bob. I appreciate the invitation to be on today. I am an extension forester here at Purdue University. Previously, I was a district or private lands forester for Indiana Department of Natural Resources, helping landowners with a variety of woodland management projects, including tree planting plans and recommendations. And previous to that, I was actually working at our Valonia State Tree Nursery, producing tree seedlings. So this planting of trees is a near and dear project and topic for me. And we'll see if we can get our slides to advance here. Oh, there we go. So I think one of the first things we want to talk about is, in fact, why are we planting trees? And obviously, we've got a lot of great reasons. But one of the historical aspects of what we call reforestation, putting trees back on where they used to be, and afforestation, getting trees on places where we historically have not had trees, is our history. So particularly here in the Midwest, and I know in many parts of Indiana, we had a long history of forest clearing to convert it to agricultural uses of a variety of types. And some of those conversions weren't well conceived. So I grew up in southern Indiana, and this very possibly could be a picture from my home county of Brown County, much of which was deforested and attempted to practice agriculture, but that agriculture obviously was not sustainable. So getting trees back on these locations is oftentimes the very best use for the land in question, and obviously offers a lot of great benefits for us environmentally and socially. And what's one of the first steps actually in thinking about how we're going to approach a tree planting that is going to be resilient on the landscape and also provide us the benefits we're looking for, and that is thinking about the objectives. So there's loads of wonderful reasons to plant trees. We get a lot of ecological, environmental, and social benefits from the planting of trees. And I've got a list here. You could certainly add to that list of many benefits, but it's important for us as a planning process to think about why is it that we are interested in planting trees? What do we hope to accomplish? And in this presentation, I'm going to lean very heavily toward the conservation benefits of planting trees. We can certainly see those benefits in the developed landscape, urban, ornamental landscapes type plantings. But my experience primarily has been in reforestation and afforestation for conservation purposes, and that's what we're going to emphasize here. So the objectives are multiple, but it's very important to kind of do a weighted average of looking at our objectives. And so think about what are the dominant things that you're looking to accomplish. This is going to help us inform how we plan this planting and what species we select, and the planting arrangements. So a lot of different aspects of actually putting that planting together. So some of the common objectives I run into when I'm helping landowners do plantings is maybe one of the most common is wildlife habitat enhancement. Some folks are looking at biological diversity, so getting a variety of native species back on the land that are absent. Many other people are interested in producing wood or forest products of a variety of types. Another really common goal is aesthetic or recreational use of properties by putting trees back in place. But we also can get some benefits from using trees for windbreaks, screening plantings, and obviously for erosion control as well. So thinking about where you want to accomplish those goals, what you want to get out of those plantings will help in the long term inform that planning process. And it is important to pull a plan together for this project. If you make a mistake planting a garden, you can replant next year and kind of solve some of those problems. Tree plantings, if they're done well, will hopefully outlive us. And so we want to make sure that we do a good job of planning and executing those plantings. And I always recommend folks to seek the advice and direction of a professional forester in the process of developing this planting plan. And the good news is that in most states in the Midwest and across the country, there are foresters that are available to help you with that planning process and even help you get the trees in the ground. Here in Indiana, we have a Department of Natural Resources, district foresters, they're state employees that work with private landowners on the ground through the Indiana Division of Forestry. That would be true in many other states across the country as well, that you can tap into your state forestry agency for advice and assistance. We also have private foresters that are working for landowners, helping them develop plans, install plantings, and helping manage those plantings over time. These are oftentimes the folks that are actually doing most of the work on the ground. This is a search site for those private foresters here in Indiana, findindianaforester.org. But if you're in another state or location, I recommend you contact your state forestry agency or your local soil and water conservation district or natural resource conservation service office or extension office, and they can typically direct you to the professional foresters that are working in your area. Another source of great information is the Natural Resource Conservation Service and the Soil and Water Conservation Districts in your counties. Most counties will have an office for these folks, and they're oftentimes kind of your first line of information for doing conservation work on the ground. And so that's a great initial starting point to look in your county to get references to additional people. One of the really striking things that we discovered in looking at tree planting in Indiana on a broad survey was that 75% of folks planting trees for conservation purposes were first-time planters. So they'd never done this before. And that when we looked at them doing it themselves versus using the services of a forester more than doubled their tree planting success. It's essentially meeting their objectives and getting established trees in the ground. And so that professional assistance can make a big difference in terms of your success. So what's part of a well-designed tree planting plan that's going to help you effectively do this? And the good news is that the forester can help you accomplish the development of this plan. So number one, we get back to our objectives. What do we hope to accomplish? We need to collect information. So maps, photos, soils information on the site, what kind of equipment and labor and financing are going to be required to get this work done based on the scale of the planting you want to do. And then what kind of timetable are we working on for planning ahead of time, preparation of the site, and then actually get the planting done. And then we need some details on the site and the type of planting that's going to be installed. So a description of site and soils, and this is going to have a big impact on the species we select, making sure they match the site that we're working on. The design of the planting. So what is the spacing between trees? How are we going to arrange different species across the planting? What type of site preparation is needed to make sure this ground is going to be ready to provide a competitive advantage to the trees, as opposed to vegetation that maybe are already on the site that's going to compete with those trees. Then we've got to actually select what trees we want to get, figure out where we can get them, and also think about, once we've got these planted, how is this going to be maintained? What kind of management needs are going to be put in place to make sure these trees establish themselves successfully? One of our most important steps is to evaluate the site that we're going to be planting on, because to a great extent, this is going to dictate what species are available to you. A great tool to start with, and this is one of the other areas your forester can help you with, is the Web Soil Survey. This is provided by the U.S. Department of Agriculture. It's an online tool that you can actually go and find your property and develop a variety of maps and tables providing information on the soil types there, their characteristics, their suitabilities, and recommendations on what trees, shrubs, and other vegetation would do well there on your site. It doesn't cover every potential selection you might make in terms of species, and so that's where you can get some additional information from your forester and other natural resource advisors. But it's a really good starting point to get basic information on the capacity of your site to grow different species. In addition to the soils information, we also have to look at what is the situation on the ground. And so we're looking at, is there a surface or tile drainage in place? Are there utilities that we need to be aware of? Are there old road beds or existing road networks that may have an impact on planted seedlings? Are there archaeological or other types of sites in place? And so that professional assistance from both your forester and the local Natural Resource Conservation Service office can really help you develop a good idea of what the capacity of your sites are and what limitations might exist there too. And so the other thing we really have to do is a good on-site evaluation. The web soil survey and those soil maps provide a good starting point, but looking at the details on the site is actually going to give us a better picture of what's possible and what kind of limitations we're working with. And then species selection is really determined by not only our objectives, but also the site, the climate that we're dealing with in a location, what species are hardy in that area, and then what species are actually available for planting, either from nurseries, seed sources, or other access points we may have for getting particular species we're interested in. So thinking about what species are going to meet our objectives, but also what species are going to suit our site is definitely a conversation you can have with your forester. Some really important considerations to make, though, is we really do encourage people to think about a diversity of tree and shrub species to help them meet their objectives. This helps us kind of buffer our essentially exposure to insect, disease, and other environmental threats that may face those seedlings that maybe we're not even aware of right now. A good example is emerald ash borer and the various ash species native to North America. Ash was a common species in many of my planting recommendations before I knew that we had EAB on the landscape, because it grew very well. It was relatively resistant to deer browse as compared to other species. And between the different species, we had all different kind of sites we could plant it on. But obviously, if I had put all my eggs in the ash basket, we would have had a real problem once EAB got here. So that diversity of species selections can be really important in terms of producing what's going to be a pretty resilient and somewhat resistant to unknown factors type of planting out there on the landscape. So those site conditions are going to indicate what species are going to survive on the site and what species are going to thrive on the site. This is another area where I see some mistakes made occasionally, and that is having a really strong desire for a particular species. So one good example is black walnut has really high timber value, but it's also very picky about what sites it grows on. And so in many cases, we've got to adjust expectations for landowners that want to plant black walnut, but they just don't have the site conditions that are going to be conducive to producing good trees over time. The good news is that we typically have a nice selection among our over 100 native hardwood trees here in the Midwest that would be suitable for those sites. And we can, of course, add in some conifers as well where that's appropriate, in particular some of those areas where conifers are more important part, more prominent part of the forest cover. The other thing I really encourage people to do is use primarily native plant species. Number one, our native species are adapted to our locations. They are co-evolved with our wildlife species, and so they have providing many benefits to a wide diversity of wildlife, all the way from the insects that wildlife are feeding on up to the food and cover production that's part of the forest environment. And the other reason to really favor natives is that sometimes when we introduce non-native species, we are also introducing the potential for an invasive, aggressive species that we have to kill later because it's exerting excess pressure on our native species. So utilizing those natives as an important part of our planting plan will help us eliminate some of those problems and really magnify the benefits we get out of those systems. So some of the objectives folks have for plantings, one of the most common ones, as we mentioned, wildlife habitat. And really what we're looking at for wildlife is food, cover, water, and space. Those are the basic life needs that make up the elements of wildlife habitat. And food and cover can be really well provided through our selections of different plant materials for wildlife habitat plantings. And we actually have a publication here at Purdue, Designing Hardwood Tree Plantings for Wildlife. And that's the publication number through Purdue Extension. That provides a really nice background on what kind of considerations you might want to make for designing tree and shrub plantings for wildlife. But once again, I'm going to go back to this diversity issue of having a wide diversity of species that are suited to your site, planted in such a way that we can maximize their benefits across the landscape. It will typically provide you the best wildlife habitat benefits. So thinking about the whole package of trees and shrubs, and then what types of forbs and grasses might even be integrated in that on the outside edges or between the rows of those plantings can provide enormous benefits. But there may be some situations where we really want to emphasize certain species if we're trying to favor particular species of wildlife. And so a good example is the oak group is very important for a wide range of wildlife, but in particular, if you're thinking about turkey or deer, that's a primary food value plant for those. And so we could think about that. For the other aspects, though, we might think about wanting to have food value almost year round on our properties. And there we can think about a mixture of trees and shrubs that are going to be providing food value in terms of its preference and availability on the plants through a good part of the year. So that diversity can really provide great benefits in attracting and keeping wildlife on our properties. For timber, another important objective that many people have is one of the things to think about is in addition to what species are going to grow well on your site, grow vigorously, what are the historic good timber markets? And we've already mentioned black walnut, but also white and red oaks, black cherry, maple, tulip tree have all had pretty decent and fairly consistent marketplaces through time. I say that right now, red oak and black cherry are not doing that great on pricing, but their time will probably shine again at some point in time. We see these markets kind of oscillate through time. Right now, the big movers are white oak and black walnut, and to a lesser extent, maple and tulip tree. But we have many species that will actually go into the marketplaces, but sometimes the unit values are not as high as the ones listed here, and they don't have as consistent marketplaces available. But those are a good selection based on your site characteristics if you're thinking about marketable timber over the long term. And the good news is that we've got a variety of species within the oaks that will fit almost any type of site that you might be considering. Another really important objective that many people have listed is aesthetics. And so we're thinking oftentimes about just the raw beauty of trees on the landscape. And so some that I think about providing values during different times of the year are spring blooming and then the fall color. And so some really good selections for spring blossoms are the redbud, flowering dogwoods, serviceberry, hawthorns, crab apples, plums and cherries, buckeye and catalpa, and the lindens. And many of these also offer some really good pollinator benefits as well. Very good benefits for bees and a variety of other pollinating insects. And there are others we could certainly add to this list. Some good fall color trees, red and sugar maple, sassafras, the sumacs, black and sweet gum, once again, the dogwoods, bald cypress and tamarack or eastern larch. The last two are actually deciduous conifers that have really pretty fall color on those needles that drop. So add some real interest and unique characteristics. And then sometimes just the visual aspects of bark can be interesting on the landscape. So things like birches, beech, sycamore, hornbeam, yellowwood, and hickories all have benefits. And like many things where aesthetics are concerned, it's really an observer's preferences in terms of what kind of values they're wanting to look at and what kind of benefits they want to find. So kind of look at that palette of tree species we've got available and think about what you might want to be looking at through the different seasons. So once again, this big selective group of trees and shrubs we have available, how do I pick the ones that are going to best suit my property? Well, you can definitely spend some time in consultation with your forester and your other natural resource advisors like the NRCS for suggestions of what might work best on your property. Another suggestion I've got for you is another Purdue Extension publication, Planting Forest Trees and Shrubs in Indiana. provides some nice lists of trees that are suitable for a variety of different habitats and their different benefits they provide. So that's a good option for thinking about what trees I could select from and for. Another excellent resource, really suitable across North America, is the USDA Ag Handbook 654, which is Silvix of North America. That is available online, and it provides probably more than you want to know about many different tree species across the nation, but really provides a great background on their growth characteristics, requirements, and the different benefits they may provide on the landscape. And then another really nice source of information that can help you select trees and shrubs you might be interested in are the ID guides that provide some additional species info along with the actual ID characteristics. And so one I've listed here is Native Trees of the Midwest. This is by some Purdue professors, but covers Midwestern trees across the area. There's also a Shrubs of Indiana and the Midwest version of this available as well. But there are many different tree guides and shrub ID guides out there that also provide species information you can utilize to help make some of those decisions. And then many of the tree nurseries that are offering trees for sale also provide descriptions of the benefits, characteristics, and preferred sites for the species they're selling. So all of those sources provide you a good outlet to, pardon me, had one pop up there. There we go, to actually make those decisions on what species might be beneficial for you on your site. So this is an example where no matter what type of site you may be on, if it can support trees, we probably got some species that are going to be suitable for that site. So on wet soils, we have a variety of oaks, even some hickories, some shrubs, bald cypress in terms of a conifer that will be suitable for growing on those sites. The well-drained soils oftentimes are friendly to a wide variety of species. And so many times, both our wet soil and dry soil species can do fine on some of these best growing ground sites. So the list is oftentimes pretty long for our better growing sites. On dry sites, once again, a little more specialized, we need trees and shrubs that are tolerant of drought or shallow soils. Once again, a good list of oaks, several hickories, persimmon for fruit production, conifers in terms of red cedar, flowering dogwood and serviceberry for the shrubs and small trees. And we could certainly add to this list. But the idea is that no matter what your site limitations might be, if it can support trees and shrubs, there are certainly some good choices out there that you can utilize to help with planting on that site and make sure those actually stay in good condition. One of our titles for this talk is the idea of resilience. And resilience is really making sure that a species is on the site that it's adapted to, can grow well on, and can survive on and be competitive over the long term. Now, when it comes to planting, another thing we've got to think about is ideally, we're oftentimes planting in relatively open, full sunlight conditions, but you may have some situations where, for whatever reason, you may be looking at planting trees or shrubs in a situation where there's shade. And those selections are going to be very important because there's a limited number of trees and shrubs that will actually tolerate deep shade. And so some trees that are very tolerant of shady conditions are on the list right here. And some of the most tolerant are sugar maple, beech, the hop hornbeam and hornbeams, which are small understory trees, flowering dogwood, American holly, and then a couple of conifers, eastern hemlock, and balsam fir. We could also add a few native spruces to that list as well. Tolerant, these are a little less shade tolerant, but still will tolerate some overhead shade and do reasonably well, although all these trees will grow better ultimately once they're exposed to full sunlight. The red and silver maple and box elder are bottomland maples, essentially. Basswood and persimmon, buckeye, northern white cedar, and then the spruces in this category. Intermediate shade means forest areas that have been thinned either through fire, harvesting, or other types of practices where we're taking out either the understory or thinning the overstory and allowing additional sunlight in. And so these areas that are getting some disturbance, whether it be natural disturbances like fires, windstorms, or man-made disturbances like prescribed fire or thinnings or harvestings, will favor these species. And you can see here we've got a variety of conifers, but also several oaks and other hardwoods that are suitable for these sites. So we can't go on the most shady spots for these, but we can get these to be competitive as seedlings and growing from seed in the understory where we've had some disturbance and opening up. And so there's this diffuse, dispersed sunlight coming into these areas. Now we have a couple lists here of trees that really need full sunlight to do well. And so whether they're growing from seed or seedlings, we need to provide enough opening that these are going to get a significant amount of sunlight through the day. So things like black walnut and butternut, several of the hickories, tulip tree, and then a wide variety of other species, including some of the conifers as well. Eastern red cedar in particular, oftentimes think of as very light demanding. And then very intolerant, really tolerant of almost no shade at all. Tamarack or eastern larch, the willows, the aspens and cottonwoods, black locust, jack pine, and Osage orange. So this gradation across the landscape of tolerant of quite a bit of shade to very intolerant of shade, important for you to be thinking about those characteristics in terms of where you're planting trees. I've seen a lot of frustration over time trying to plant trees in forest understories to get additional species added in where there just was not enough sunlight to support the growth of those trees. This is an area, once again, where your forester can help you evaluate the conditions of your property and make recommendations of where you might be able to plant some of these species if you're looking at some underplanting or forest opening plantings where there's maybe not as much sunlight available as what we do in an open field planting. So one of the situations we've seen in the past, and I think is going to be common going forward, is a high demand on seedling stock for conservation tree planting. And so I encourage people to plan early for their tree plantings, to start a year in advance of when you plan to plant your trees in terms of talking to a forester, evaluating your site, developing your plan, and then getting ready to order your seedlings is not a bad idea. And so for many nurseries, you can actually place orders several months in advance of seedling availability. And that's oftentimes a good idea because in many cases, these nurseries will sell out of trees or sell out of some species that may be on your list, creating complications for your tree planting plan. So getting yourself prepared early with that list and alternatives that are acceptable substitutes on that list can really help you get the trees you're looking for. Sources of seedlings for conservation planting, state forest tree nurseries. There's several still operational in the Midwestern area, including Indiana. There's also a variety of private nurseries that are specializing in what we would call reforestation or conservation style stock, as opposed to landscape style stock. Local soil and water conservation districts and other local conservation organizations oftentimes have tree sales now. So check with your local entities to see what tree seedlings may be available through them. And then a really nice resource for finding nurseries and other tree seedling availability points is the www.rngr.net site. This is a site that's co-sponsored by the Forest Service that provides listings and access points to seedling stock around the country. So a really good reference point there if you're looking for where you can get a hold of good planting stock. This is Bob Hawkins, our state nursery supervisor at Valonia Nursery here in Indiana, in some nice oak seed beds. So many of these nurseries are producing millions of trees a year, but that sounds like a lot, but boy, it can go really fast when we're doing pretty big plantings with lots of trees per acre. And so some of the different stocks that you may be available to get for planting, and one of the most common ones is bare root seedlings. So this is a bare root conifer, and it sure doesn't look like much, but if it's planted well and taken care of, these can actually do quite nicely. This is bare root pecan from the Indiana State Nursery, one of our hardwoods. But some of the other types of stock that are available are containerized seedlings in a variety of different sizes. So this is a small conifer, probably a spruce, that's available for containerized stock. And you can even get containerized stock for hardwoods in a variety of different sizes and configurations. And these may have the advantage of having an existing root system that's not disturbed by being pulled out of the nursery, but they're also oftentimes limited in their size by the size of the container. So there are always trade-offs between these two approaches. You can get 50 to 100 seedlings in a bundle that you could throw in the back of a car for bare root seedlings. Obviously, the space occupied by containers, significantly more space needed. So thinking about the trade-off between root system, size of seedlings, cost, and just the logistics of planting are all going to be considerations in terms of what kind of stock you're going to use. Less commonly used, but still a possibility for some purposes, particularly the poplars and the willows, are cuttings. And so these cuttings can be buried about halfway in the soil in wet sites or moist sites, and in many cases will root and actually produce a seedling. And then some people elect to do what we call direct seeding. And so taking actual seed and planting it or scattering it on sites to produce new trees. And that can work reasonably well in some locations. However, the seed predators, things like squirrels and rodents, can actually work over these, particularly if there's not a lot of seed available that year. So another thing to do some consultation with your forester, and others that have some experience with this before you maybe jump in. If you are interested in growing trees from seed, a really good resource is the Woody Plant Seed Manual. This is another USDA publication available online that can give you pretty much the information you need to germinate trees from seed. Woody Plant Seed Manual. So we talked a lot about seed or seedling selection and species. The other aspect that goes into planting is how are we going to arrange these plantings? What kind of spacing? And for many people, their objectives to some extent will dictate this, but also maybe some operational considerations and economics in terms of how many seedlings we've got and how much money we can spend on planting. As a forester, I'm really kind of a fan of tighter spacings. So anywhere from that 6x6 to maybe a 10x6 or 7 is kind of, I think, the sweet spot for producing high quality reforestation sites where we get a lot of trees on the ground, we get early shading, and all the benefits of that quick forest type environment. If you're aiming for a little more open planting with a little bit more herbaceous material underneath and more space to maintain that material on the ground, maybe for wildlife benefits, you can look at wider spacings. And you may actually have to look at wider spacings depending on the equipment you're using for the planting and a variety of different maintenance practices. So all those are considerations in terms of what you want to accomplish and what kind of limits you might have on operational equipment and maintenance over time. But you can see the number of trees per acre. And oftentimes a lot of our plantings are 8x8, so 680 trees per acre. Now you can see how those millions of seedlings at the nursery can get gobbled up pretty quick if we're doing very large plantings on the landscape. So this is an 8x8 planting in a forest opening of black walnut. We also planted oaks on the outside edge, and that 8x8 spacing is casting shade on the forest floor, forcing these trees to grow straight and tall, and hopefully over the long term producing pretty good timber by pruning limbs off the sides and creating a really nice forest environment. And even a higher density here, this is 3 feet by 3 feet, which is exceptionally heavy, but actually can help overwhelm deer and other plant predators and produce some really nice trees in a really fast forest environment. One of the other considerations we've got is the relative growth rates of the trees that we're planting. And so we have to think about how fast different species grow in the landscape in relation to how we are organizing our planting and what trees are next to each other. And so thinking about on good sites, species like tulip tree, cherry, black walnut are going to typically outgrow most of the oaks. And so you would want to consider that in terms of the arrangement of these species on the landscape. Otherwise, you've got some really hard decisions to make when it comes time to thin to favor different species. If you planted your oaks in a mixture with these other species and they're all twice as big and over the top, you literally have to go through and kill all of those seedlings or saplings to favor the oaks going forward, where if you had put them in blocks with relatively similar growth rates together, you could then make choices within those species groups of which individuals were the best. So thinking about that growth rate, asking those questions of your forester, making sure you're making arrangements that give you better decision-making ability once it comes time to thin will help you keep that diversity in your plantings. And also, in some spots, thinking about how big those trees may get and whether you've actually got space to plant them. And so I'm thinking about plantings that may be near power line right-of-ways or other utilities. You may want to move to shrubs or other smaller statured plants that are going to conflict with some of those infrastructure elements out there on the landscape. Another thing I encourage people to consider is what we call nurse trees. So rows of trees that are actually there primarily to provide some cover and shaping and encouragement essentially to grow straight and well to the trees that we want to keep in the planting over the long term. So here we've got white pine planted with a variety of oaks. The white pine has shaded the understory, helping keep weed pressure down, and also force those oaks to grow straight and tall up to the sunlight. We can then go in and thin out the rows of white pine to produce some release of the crowns to grow for the oaks. And so this can be a really neat technique we can utilize on the landscape to help our trees grow better and then also make our thinning decisions down the road a little easier. Another thing I like to see done, especially in open plantings on open ground, is windbreaks around the outside edge. In many cases, this provides some benefits in terms of less wind stress on the trees and also knocking down herbicide drift and some other things that can create issues for those planted trees in open environments. So site preparation is one of our important steps to help us prepare for effective tree planting and good success. And it actually involves work well ahead of our planting. So our starting point is actually going to those soils maps, as we mentioned earlier. And also, I oftentimes recommend folks do an actual soil test to see what the nutrient content of their site is, and if there are any deficiencies on that, to address those with fertilization, liming, or whatever you need to do prior to planting. That's the easiest time to get that work done. We also have to think about what weed pressure we've got on the sites that we're looking to plant. And so perennial weeds, heavy grasses like fescue can actually compete in a variety of ways, both in terms of height, occupying the soil, available nutrients and moisture, and even waging chemical warfare in some cases against planted seedlings. So eliminating a lot of those perennial plants that are acting as competition for our trees and shrubs we want to plant is a really good technique prior to planting. That's the easiest time to do that as well. Also, if we've got invasive species, shrubs or vines, we want to address those at this point in time as well. That's the easiest time to do it is prior to planting. Some sites that we work on actually have compaction issues from past land uses, and we may find it beneficial to use a soil ripper or a subsurface tool to break up that compaction, particularly in the lines or rows where we're going to plant our seedlings. And this is oftentimes done in the fall before planting actually takes place. You may want to consider a cover crop depending on the conditions on your site. Cover crops can help reduce erosion. They can also help suppress undesirable weeds, but they also serve as a bit of a competition still for the seedlings. So you may still want to think about a good selection for those in terms of a relatively non-competitive plant and perhaps an annual that's not going to continually provide competition. And also sometimes that extra cover can actually be a place for mice and rabbits to live that may want to gnaw on your seedlings. So there's kind of some balancing acts there, and doing some on-site evaluation with your natural resource professionals like your foresters and soil conservation folks will help you make some of those decisions. Good weed control does pay good benefits though. And so one of the things we're looking for is to provide those seedlings and or seed an advantage for the first 2 to 3 years that they're growing over potential competing vegetation. And so this is going to help them establish root systems, establish a top, and provide them an advantage over what can be very rapidly growing weeds and other woody plants on those sites. And this often involves the use of herbicides in rows around the seedlings. And that herbicide selection is really important because it has to be compatible with the growth of the trees, but applied at a rate that's going to either stop or resist the growth of the weeds. And so this is oftentimes an area where, once again, some professional direction and assistance is a good idea. The other thing it does is these open ground areas help prevent some of the damage we see from rodents and rabbits. If we've got a really weedy, heavy cover area, rodents and rabbits can proliferate, and oftentimes we find them chewing on the seedlings, particularly down at the bases on the bark. And with hardwoods, they will kill them back to the ground. Oftentimes we get resprouts, but if that occurs over 2 or 3 years, we can actually start losing seedlings. And obviously your seedlings aren't making any advances if they're being top killed year from year by rodents or rabbits. So this more open condition provides benefits, not only in establishment, but also in limiting the damage from those agents. But we've got another critter on the landscape that we've got to consider, and that is white-tailed deer. And so in many cases across the landscape, we've got pretty high populations of white-tailed deer, and they love to munch on our trees. And particularly, it seems like seedlings from nurseries that have been well fertilized and are just really tasty little popsicles out there, essentially, once we plant them and provide good weed control. And so what we found is that we really need to be thinking about protection in areas where deer pressure is going to be significant on our seedlings. This is a good example. This was a planting that went in 2008. And on either side of the fence, same species planted, same year, very similar sites. Primary difference is the deer exclusion fence. And this picture was taken mid-season in 2010. And so you can see the significant difference that protection from deer browse made on this planting site. The trees on the right are still out there, but they're all less than knee-high in general because of deer browse. And we revisited this 9 years later to take a look at the areas we'd already taken the fence down after about 7 or 8 years. And this is the planting that was protected after 9 years of growth. And this was the unprotected planting after 9 years of growth. And so we still don't have an established tree planting providing forest benefits because of that deer pressure. So what do we do about that? Well, fencing is one of the options. And so this is another example of a woodland opening where we did tree planting, but also accepted some volunteers of trees seeding into that area. And it was fenced, maintained the fence once again for 7 or 8 years. And this is 15 years after the planting. And we've got both the planted seedlings and also volunteers creating a really nice forest environment in this forest opening. On the opposite side of this, we had a planting that was not fenced, and we had almost zero of the planted seedlings left there. We did get volunteering of species like tulip tree that are not really highly favored by deer and also grow pretty quickly. But the species composition was much less diverse in that area because the deer had really whittled down the oaks, the cherries, and the walnut that had been planted there through browsing. So protection of your plantings from deer may be one of your more important practices after you get that planting done to make sure they get established and you've got a nice, diverse, resilient planting after the fact. This is another approach using electrified fencing. And so this landowner was creating forest openings, planting into the openings, and then establishing an electrified band fence around the outside edge. And typically these are baited. And so you'll take either a little scent cups, put like an apple or some other fruit scent in it, or foil with peanut butter on it. And the deer come up and out of curiosity and hunger try to nose that, get a jolt, and they associate that pain with the fence. But these require maintenance just like any other fence does. And then what can happen is plants or twigs, whatever, can ride them down and discharge them. Or if you don't keep them baited, the deer can just finally figure out, well, I'm just going to go over the top of that. So it's a good idea to maintain that baiting over time to help condition the deer to recognize this is a danger and that's something they want to stay away from. The good news is what we've seen is when we provide protection to planted seedlings, oftentimes within 3 or 4 years, many of the seedlings are above browse height in terms of the top buds for those seedlings. And so these fences don't have to stay up forever. In many cases, 5 or 6 years of fencing, and most of our seedlings are free to grow and in good condition. Another option is tree tubes. And so the tree tubes can be established around individually planted seedlings or even natural regeneration. And what we're starting to do now is widely space planted seedlings in some openings to make sure we get some of the species that we want in these forest regeneration areas, and then protecting them intentionally with tree tubes. And so we can refine these seedlings to do thinning around them, and we're protecting them, helping them escape the deer browse until they get some height on them. And actually, if you look in the back of this photo, we can see a couple of trees are already popping out of the tubes 1 to 2 years after planting. These tubes kind of produce a little bit of a greenhouse environment. The seedlings want to get up and out into the sunlight. And then once they're out, they kind of tend to sit there a while and kind of develop root systems. So you want to leave the tree tubes on. It also helps prevent some of the buck rub that can be problematic on the stems. But this is another technique to help establish seedlings in the face of deer browse pressure. And so we do it in the openings. We also can do it in forest management areas where we've done what we call shelter wood. This is where we've taken out the understory of a forest and perhaps even use prescribed fire like we did on this site, and then come in and plant seedlings and place the tree tubes around those, protecting them from deer browse. And so this is another way to help amend the natural regeneration that happens in forests with species that we are concerned we're not getting enough regeneration of, or we want to reintroduce to that site, perhaps because they've been eliminated in the past. Now, if we've been successful and got our seedlings established, and now we're enjoying watching them grow, we give them some deer protection so they're moving past the deer, getting some height. What's going to happen next is one of the harder things for many landowners, and that is recognizing that competition is building up in these forest environments. And what it's doing is creating stress between the trees. And so these trees are all fighting for sunlight, looking for space. And they're competing with each other and therefore compressing the crowns, which is the growth engine of the tree. And this added stress can actually make trees more susceptible to environmental stresses like drought or insect and disease attack. And so what we oftentimes are recommending is some active management in these locations to help reduce the stress and make these overall stands more resilient by favoring the growth of certain trees over others. And so here's an example of a clear cut. Actually, it was created in Hoosier National Forest probably about 20 to 25 years before we see this photo here. And the foresters have come in and thinned this area to favor the growth of the desirable tree species on this site, and that's mostly favoring many of the oaks. And in fact, they've probably killed quite a few oaks to provide additional space for other seedlings to continue to grow and expand that crown and canopy and maintain good vigor. And so this practice of thinning, if it's well timed, can actually reduce the stress that occurs in natural forests as the competition is building. The forest will thin itself, but it typically will take longer. It oftentimes ends up killing more trees, particularly if we have a drought, and the trees remaining may not be the ones you'd hope to have. And so by selecting the timing and the technique of our thinning, we can actually have a positive impact on overall growth, vigor, and health through time. And one technique you can utilize, and actually it's pretty simple, it's something landowners can do themselves, is think about what we call crop tree management. And here's where we're selecting crop trees that match your objectives. And so we're thinking about what species are doing the best job of achieving the objectives you want to accomplish on your planting. We then, after we've selected those, thin around the crowns of those trees. So we're killing trees that are directly competing with the live crown area of that tree. And if we divide that tree up into quarters, we would want 3 or 4 quarters of that tree free from competition. So it involves the killing of several trees around the canopy of that individual tree. So you can decide what intensity of thinning you want to do by how many crop trees you select. And typically we're encouraging people to think about 25 to 30 crop trees per acre or less. And so if you went 25 to 30 trees per acre, you would have, if you spread them out evenly across the site, trees about 40 feet apart that you're going to be favoring their growth through time through this thinning process. So the good news is we've mentioned several different management practices: planting, thinning, controlling invasive species that might be coming into these areas to maintain good health. The good news is that there's actually cost-sharing assistance through the U.S. Department of Agriculture for these practices. And so if you're considering doing tree planting, weed control in your plantings, protective measures to protect your seedlings from deer, and then after the fact or as site preparation, thinning, pruning, or invasive species control, all these potentially could be covered through some USDA cost assistance programs. And so once again, contact your Natural Resource Conservation Service in your county or the Farm Service Agency. They're typically in the same office, and oftentimes the Soil and Water Conservation District is in that office as well. And see what kind of cost share programs might be available, what you might be interested in. This is another thing that you want to be doing well in advance of your plans for planting and management, because it can take a while to get plugged into these programs, but in many cases, they provide some really good benefits for some cost assistance for landowners, in addition to the technical assistance you'll get from Natural Resource Conservation Service and associated foresters. And if you're looking for your county office, you can go to the NRCS website and search for your local service center for your county. So to summarize this long discussion over tree planting, we could have gone 2 hours, but we're going to stop at about an hour 45 or 50 here. Seek professional assistance to avoid the mistakes. They're painful mistakes when you've got to live with them for a long time at a tree planting. Have that professional assistance help you develop your plan, making sure you're matching your species to your site and the objectives you've got for planting. Use native plants as much as possible. They're adapted. They're providing the benefits to wildlife. They're supposed to be here. They're not going to create weedy problems in most cases as compared to introduced plants. Diversification for the resilience of our forest, along with these other practices. Providing protection from weeds and deer for the establishment of your planted seedlings or seed. And then thinning to favor the continued growth and vigor of that planting. And that's one of the hardest parts. You've watched those trees grow for years, and now you're killing some to favor the growth of others. But it's an important practice that'll maintain good vigor and growth on your forest area. So appreciate the opportunity to present today. If you'd like to visit our website, I've got it in format here, and also the QR code. So you can tap into either one of those, or also if you have questions for me, I'm sure we're going to